Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Carla Thorson, and I'm pleased to be the moderator today for this special Commonwealth Club program, Ukraine Under Siege, What's Next? And I would add, what can be done? Welcome to all, and thank you to our partners at World Affairs for joining us today as well. I'm the new Vice President of Programs at the Commonwealth Club, and I'm really pleased to be joining this team. And while I'm delighted to moderate this conversation today, I'm also sorry to have the focus be on a Russian invasion of Ukraine, a war that I personally had hoped to never see and one that really should never have begun. So as we're talking today, it's been a little over a week since Russian forces advanced into Ukraine from the north, south, and east, and are attempting to lay siege to the capital city of Kyiv and the second largest city of Kharkiv, as well as other major population centers. And while President Zelensky rallies his forces and his people, vowing to fight the Russian takeover of his country, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, are fleeing into neighboring countries in Eastern Europe. And the UN Refugee Agency reports that close to 750,000 refugees are already in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Moldova, and these numbers are continuing to grow. The battle currently unfolding within Ukraine's borders is the largest military action in Europe since the end of World War II, and it threatens to destabilize Europe and the NATO alliance and will have major implications for the global economy to come. Joining me today are Dr. Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Club, who joins us today with her expertise as former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, with a focus on arms control and an extensive background on US-Russia and US-Ukrainian relations. Rose Gottemoeller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019, and Stephen Pifer, former US Ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000, and with many more years at the State Department and on the National Security Council focused on US relations with Russia and Eastern Europe. And I would add that all three of you have deep expertise on questions of arms control and weapons of mass destruction, a subject that we can't ignore when it comes to a military engagement involving Russia. So before we jump into our conversation, a reminder that we want your audience questions. So if you have a question for any of our guests or for me, please do put them in the YouTube chat feature, and questions will be forwarded to me during the program. So I hope to get to as many of them as possible in the latter half of the program. So with that, let's get started. I think everyone joining us today is probably following the daily news reports to a greater or lesser degree. So I'd like to get a bit beyond the immediate headlines and get a higher level view of the conflict and the risks that you all see, both in the near term and also for the future. So I think I'll start with Steve, and do know that I may direct a question to one of you individually, but I do want to encourage everyone to feel that they can chime in on any subject that we take on and have this really be a conversation. So Steve, I'm going to start with you. Having been ambassador to Ukraine in its early years of independence, can you give us some perspective on the history of the relationship between an independent Ukraine and Russia? What has happened and what has prompted Russian President Putin to resort to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, no, this crisis really had its roots, I would say, back in 2013, at a time when Ukraine under the then government had no desire to join NATO, but it wanted to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And in late 2013, the Russian government put a lot of pressure on then President Yanukovych not to do that. In the end, Mr. Yanukovych decided not to sign, and that triggered that night the first demonstrations of the Maidan Revolution. And then over those 3 months, the revolution really morphed from a pro-European Union revolution into an anti-Yanukovych because of his growing autocracy. After violence, Yanukovych fled. There was an interim government. They said the first goal was to sign the association agreement. And I think the Kremlin panicked. You saw Russia seize Crimea, provoke the conflict in Donbass, which took 14,000 lives over 8 years. And that's kind of the background. But it reached a point, I believe, in the last few months where President Putin had two real concerns. One concern was about domestic politics in Russia. And that was a concern that a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful Ukraine would be a nightmare for the Kremlin, because that kind of Ukraine would cause Russians to say, why can't we have the same democracy, the same political voice they have in Ukraine? So in one sense, this is about Russian domestic politics, and it's very much about regime survival for the Kremlin. The other concern was that Ukraine was irretrievably slipping out of Moscow's orbit and in towards the West. Now, I would argue Russian policy over the past 8 years did more than anything to push Ukraine away, to push it towards the West, and to stoke up interest in joining NATO. 10 years ago in a poll, 10% of Ukrainians would have said that they wanted to see their country in NATO. The last poll I saw last week had 62%. That's all a result of Russian action. So I think what the Russians are trying to achieve now, I fear, is a pretty maximalist goal on the part of Putin, which is to occupy a good part of Ukraine, to get to Kyiv, to depose the current government, and put in place a different government that would be more pro-Russian. Now, if they achieve that, and I'm not sure that they can, I mean, certainly the Russians have on their side the advantage of numbers and mass and modern equipment. The Ukrainians have on their side determination, tenacity, and a real desire to protect their country and preserve their independence. But even if the Russians at the end of the day win, and they put that pro-Russian government in, that government doesn't last for 2 minutes after the Russians leave. So in sort of what you might call from the Moscows, the best case where they win the military battle, they will be occupying Ukraine for years or decades with a hostile and angry population.
So you may have answered this question, but I've heard recently that your colleague at Stanford, Ambassador Michael McFaul, has been quoted as saying that he doesn't really think Putin has an end game, that he doesn't really know what he's going to be able to do. So do you think he's right about that? And are there short-term objectives that you think that Putin can achieve?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the scale of the military operation, I think when the operation began last Thursday, you could see two possibilities. One would have been consistent with Putin saying, we're not going to occupy the country and we want to demilitarize the country. But that would have been an operation focused around Donbass and perhaps attacking and degrading Ukrainian military forces in the eastern part of the country. But you now see the offensive really coming from multiple directions, with a huge push, although it's been stalled for the last 3 days, coming out of Belarus towards Kyiv. And so that leads me to think that his objective is not just something around Donbass in the east, but that he has a much wider plan, including taking Kyiv. I hope I'm wrong on that. I would be happy to be wrong on that, because that might open up some possibilities to resolve this. But if he is going after Kyiv, then I think it then makes it very hard for diplomacy to find some kind of a middle ground between Putin and the Ukrainian government.
Thank you, Steve. Well, let's come back to that question. I want to turn now to Rose Gottemuller and ask about the longer term objectives. There's certainly been a lot of discussion about whether or not Putin's ultimate goal is to undermine the NATO alliance, and that he really won't stop with Ukraine. So this question is for you. What are the risks to the NATO alliance and neighboring states if the conflict were to escalate? And how well is NATO positioned to respond? Just a small question.
Thank you, Carla. I did want to add also to the point about what's driving Putin. And it is very clear that he has been isolated seriously during this pandemic period and has been stewing in his own juices. Last summer, he published a 6,000-word treatise talking about the necessity of recreating the Slavic heartland, as I call it, wanting to put Ukraine back into a confederation with Russia and Belarus, protecting Russian-speaking peoples. I thought it was amusing today that President Zelensky of Ukraine said, we don't need our Russian-speaking peoples protected. Protect your own Russian-speaking peoples inside the borders of Russia. So, but that seems to be one of Putin's goals. It's a conservative nationalistic approach, also I think related to his sense of religiosity as well, linked to the Russian Orthodox Church and the fact that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has set itself up as an independent body, independent of the Moscow Patriarchate. All of these are things that have really been eating at Putin. The other factor here is that he's in a small bubble with very few advisors, and these advisors don't give him information that he doesn't want to hear, what we call yes men, I think. And they are mostly men. I think there's one woman among them, possibly. But honestly, it's in a way, it's a classic kind of story of an isolated dictator. And that is, I think, a really important danger now. As to the danger to the NATO alliance per se, NATO, yes, has been very concerned about Russia since Crimea. It was at that time that Russia upped its defense. I'm sorry, that NATO upped its defense spending. Russia has been upping its defense spending too, pouring money into military modernization, both at the conventional and the nuclear level. But NATO in Wales in 2014 gave an investment pledge to spend 2% of GDP on defense. It was this defense investment pledge that was so frustrating for President Donald Trump because he couldn't get the NATO allies, all of them, to step up to it. And Germany was a special frustration for Mr. Trump. I just want to note how this crisis, again, has changed NATO in terms of driving it together and getting countries like Germany to step up to those commitments. And this past weekend on Sunday, the German chancellor gave it was a remarkable speech to the German public and said, look, we are going to be spending 2% on GDP, which is huge. It's a huge GDP in Germany. And that means that they will be really modernizing their armed forces. So NATO is being driven into tighter coherence. Defense spending, I think I've seen across the NATO alliance commitments to higher defense spending. This is all very good. Poland, I think, is committed to 3% of GDP. So there's a real move now to pay attention for the long run to what needs to be done to deter and defend Russia. And that is going to be all important because this is going to last for a long time. And finally, I would say in the immediate period, in a more tactical moment that we are in now, NATO is actually pretty well prepared to deal with possible spillover in air incidents and sea incidents from the invasion of Ukraine because it practices all the time. Since Crimea in 2014, NATO air policing has been operating out of the Baltic states, and they are very well practiced now at turning back Russian air incursions and making sure they are safely escorted back out of NATO airspace. So that's just an example, but NATO has definitely been preparing for this moment in many ways, both tactical and now looking at the longer term too.
Well, thank you. That's good to hear. And I think the questions of escalation go sort of well beyond conventional war, spilling over into neighboring states. And so, Gloria, I'd like to turn to you and with your experience working with WMD and on arms control with Russia, what concerns you most regarding the risks of other kinds of attacks? How should we prepare, and what unexpected ways might this conflict spread?
Well, thank you, Carla. And I will just say we have seen a level of Russian veiled and not so veiled threats about using nuclear weapons. And I think that is perhaps the most dire concern that many people have about the possibility of this war escalating. There are other issues related to NATO and so on with regard to escalation, but just let me start by saying the Russians have the largest nuclear force in the world. They have not committed themselves against the use of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons play an important role in Russian military doctrine. Russia did not, for example, sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that came into force last year. Some people think that he made the threat that he made a few days ago as the war in Ukraine began to seem more difficult than he'd expected. But to me, it looks as though waiving the nuclear threat may have been part of his plan from the beginning. You remember that there were some nuclear systems tests that went on right before the war was launched, right before the attack was launched. And then, of course, a few days ago, he raised the alert level of Russian nuclear forces. I believe it's to DEFCON 2, and made the statement about whoever tries to hinder us will face consequences that you've never faced in your history, which seems like a fairly clear reference to nuclear weapons. Nobody is exactly sure what that means or what it could mean. The use of tactical nuclear weapons against NATO, the use of some type of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the use of strategic nuclear weapons against the US, an empty threat, an actual intention. But it is very worrying and very disturbing. I should say I woke up this morning very pleased to see Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia making a public statement that Russia has no thoughts of nuclear war. That appeared to back Russia off from Putin's statements a few days before. It was very nice to see someone in the Russian leadership exhibiting some prudence. And a footnote here is that that may indicate some worry and dissension going on among perhaps some of the more responsible members of the leadership in Russia about the extent to which Putin has gotten out on a limb here. Nonetheless, the fact that Putin made those statements is of great concern. Putin is violating many different agreements on many different levels, many different international agreements. Ukraine did have nuclear weapons, as my colleagues here and most people know. Prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, they had nuclear weapons on their territory at least. And when they gave up those weapons, about 1,700 nuclear weapons, there was an agreement signed between the US, the United Kingdom, Russia, and Ukraine called the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, stating that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, none of the other parties would threaten Ukraine and would respect its territorial integrity. So on many levels, Russia is violating this agreement as well as waiving the nuclear threat. The fact that they have done that is, I think, creating some concern by the US and NATO about keeping a very bright line, stating that we won't commit troops, that NATO will not enforce a no-fly zone. I think there have been some promises of fighter aircraft to provide to Ukraine, and I don't know that at this point they are actually being delivered by those who have promised them, all because of the concern to not see this conflict escalate, not engage NATO, not engage the US directly, and keep that line with the hope that there will be no escalation to a nuclear level.
Thank you, Gloria. Rose, you wanted to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a brief two-finger to Gloria's comment. I did want to remark, Gloria, that the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, none of the P5 so-called nuclear weapon states under the NPT signed that. But what the P5 did, the weapon states are UK, France, Russia, China, and the United States. What they did do in January was to all agree to a statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. This is a statement originally made by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev back in the mid-1980s. So I do think it's important at this moment to remind the Russians of this recent pledge on their part, number one. But number two, you might have noticed earlier in the week, the Minister of Defense, Mr. Shoigu, was reporting quite openly to President Putin that the number of personnel at command posts for the nuclear forces have been raised. And this seems to me, from reading between the lines, to be what so far has happened, because actually the missile forces are on high alert anyway, and the US missile forces are on high alert. What they have done seemingly is to bolster personnel at the command posts for the nuclear forces and also for the strategic, as they say, strategic offensive and defensive forces. So that means their missile defense forces as well. And that's my understanding of what has happened. I'm not sure, Gloria, I would characterize it as DEFCON 2. I don't know if they go by those same terms that we do.
So President Biden's response to Vladimir Putin's raising the nuclear forces to special combat readiness, it was pretty public. He publicly said he wasn't too worried. But I wonder, should we be worried, or is the president, making a public statement to try and reassure, but at the same time, should we be concerned?
I think our deterrent behavior has been very good up to this point. I'd be interested to hear what Steve and Gloria think about it. But the way I think the Pentagon and the White House has been handling this has been deft. So, Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I would actually contrast. I mean, I thought that Mr. Putin's statement on Sunday was wholly irresponsible. There was no threat to Russia that justified that. And I would contrast it with a very responsible attitude that Secretary of Defense Austin took, where yesterday he postponed a test of the Minuteman ICBM because he thought this was the kind of thing now when there's a sense of crisis that could be subject to misunderstanding. So I think the administration is handling this just about right.
Good.
Yes,
Well, so
agreed.
Sorry, go ahead,
Very,
Gloria.
very well done. Agreed by this administration.
So let me raise another question. It's something that's been discussed a little bit in the press, and then we haven't seen too much evidence that it's happening. But has Russia used cyber warfare against Ukraine? He certainly has in the past. Certainly has used it in Georgia. And is there any evidence that cyber warfare has been used in recent days or weeks and had an impact that goes beyond Ukraine? And I leave it open to whoever would like to take that one on.
I'm happy to start us off. My understanding is that prior to the invasion, Russian hackers defaced and took offline some Ukrainian websites, attacked Ukrainian government systems with malware. They have not, as far as I know, taken down critical infrastructure in Ukraine, which possibly they could be able to do. Some people are speculating it's because they are using some of the critical infrastructure for the invasion. There have been counterattacks. Ukraine and its friends outside the country have fought back. They took down the Kremlin website. I've been checking that recently, and one cannot get the Kremlin website up on the internet. They also have took down the Gazprom website and also the Russian space agency, Roscosmos. Now, the latest in this tit for tat, the latest thing that's happened is that the hacker group Anonymous has declared war on Russia. And now there's a Russian hacker group called Killnet that's trying to disrupt Anonymous. So it goes back and forth. There is, I think, danger for the US and Europe that we need to pay attention to, critical infrastructure, our business, financials, and other systems. And I know that we are paying attention to defensive measures in that area.
Thank you, Gloria.
I think it's
Also-
fascinating. If I could just add a quick comment, I think it's fascinating, and this will be long studied, I know, but the fact that we have, cyber warfare, we always, and at NATO, we were always thinking about it as that kind of hybrid warfare, but it was always the focus on a government perpetrating that hybrid action. And indeed, we saw many, many attacks while I was at NATO from Russia on NATO sites and NATO capabilities. But now we've got this mix of non-government hacktivists, and now with the Russian side diving in as well on this, it's a fascinating phenomenon, and I think is going to be worth probably a lot of study and a number of PhD theses probably.
Yeah, and potentially it could be risky. I mean, to the extent that the Russian and Ukrainian governments are exercising some moderation in their cyber attacks, could something by a non-governmental actor trigger escalation and then have this thing get ratcheted up in a way that perhaps Moscow and Kyiv did not intend?
Interesting questions. So let's turn for a moment to within things happening within Europe. President Putin has clearly been trying to prevent Ukraine from joining the European Union as well as joining NATO. And Steve, you pointed to this at the beginning of our conversation. And President Zelensky 2 days ago signed an application for EU membership and did a fast track to membership. So is this just a symbolic act of defiance on his part, or is there more to it than that? I mean, the EU is clearly different from NATO, and yet there could be some benefits to Ukraine joining the EU even now. So what might that actually entail, and is it even likely? And are there some military benefits as well as economic ones that might come from Ukraine as a result? And Steve, maybe I'll start with you on this.
Yeah, no, I can understand Ukraine's desire to join the European Union. Of course, this predates the current conflict, but I think it's plainly unrealistic. Now, what might happen, which has not happened, is it might be that the European Union can create a membership perspective for Ukraine. Because even in that association agreement, it did not have language that suggested that Ukraine might one day aspire to membership. But when you look at what it takes to join the European Union, all of the legal changes, the regulatory changes, I mean, these are thousands and thousands of pages of regulations to make your internal norms and rules consistent with those of the European Union. And Ukraine has made some progress, but they've got a lot to do. I think there's a second problem that works against Ukraine, and this is that Ukraine still has a relatively weak economy with a relatively low gross domestic product per person. And so a country like Ukraine coming into the EU, that makes a huge demand for the central EU development funds, which right now go to the former Central European countries and some to Southern Europe. And my guess is a lot of members would sort of be worried about that until Ukraine improves its economy, that it would soak up all of those funds that now go to other EU countries. So my guess is that this was unrealistic. But what I would hope that would come out of this would be a firm statement by the European Union that yes, when Ukraine can meet the criteria, it too can expect to be a member and be welcomed as a member, because the EU for 30 years has not said that.
Well, interestingly, I heard late yesterday that Georgia had also now signed an application to join the European Union. So it's an interesting ripple effect. Rose or Gloria, do you want to comment on this question?
I just want to make a really quick comment. I mentioned a moment ago that Putin has driven NATO together, and the coherence and the common purpose of NATO is very strong, but it's also done the same thing for the European Union. We've seen, for example, Hungary and Poland, who were very much, at odds with Angela Merkel at the time when the immigration crisis happened in 2017 and have stood very firmly against immigration. They are the ones who are throwing open their borders to the refugees from Ukraine. And so everybody in the European Union, as well as in NATO, there's of course cross-membership in each. It's driving them together. It's driving the two organizations together. When I was DSG at NATO, it wasn't always easy for NATO to cooperate with the EU and vice versa, but we were getting slowly better. Now I just see them driven very, very tightly together. It was not, I think, by accident the other day that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, went to NATO to announce the special action that the European Union had agreed to place some additional constraints on Russia, serious financial sanctions. And I think that was a very good move. I just heard this morning, by the way, that the UK foreign secretary was being invited to the EU foreign ministers meeting. And that's the first time since Brexit that she has been invited to go back to the EU headquarters. So it's also driving the UK back to the EU again. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, not something, of course, that Putin could have wanted, I suppose.
Well, so to come back to Putin himself, I do have a question about diplomacy. And Steve, you raised this as well. Is diplomacy a dead end at this point? Putin seems to have used it initially as a means to sort of deflect and delay as he readied his forces to invade. And now that the invasion is in full swing, what purpose might negotiations serve for Ukraine and Russia? And since both Steve and Rose, you've both been involved in Track 2 negotiations, and Gloria as well, with Russia behind the scenes, may I ask if there are any signs that this kind of diplomacy might be possible to get us out of this crisis? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start. No, I think when you go back to December, when Russia proposed these two draft agreements, one between the United States and Russia, the second between NATO and Russia, it had a number of demands that NATO and the United States were simply not going to meet. They were not going to agree to withdraw military forces from the countries that joined the alliance after 1997. Those forces were relatively small. They were not going to agree to forever ban further enlargement. But there were elements, and both the United States and NATO picked up and said there's some arms control measures and risk reduction and confidence and transparency measures that actually, if the sides sat down at the table, first of all, we know how to do this. We did this in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. But those measures would make a genuine contribution to security in Europe, including to Russian security. But the Russians kind of wiped that away and said, well, no, you didn't respond to our other demands that NATO not enlarge. And that's one of the things that's left me pessimistic, about the Russian readiness to negotiate. And I have to say that over the last couple of weeks, and certainly since last Thursday, you really haven't seen any rhetoric coming out of Moscow that suggests there's a readiness to engage in a serious way. Now, it has been good. Today, Ukrainians and Russians met for the second time. I think the one positive thing came out is there appears to be, at least the sides are reporting, some agreement on establishing some humanitarian corridors to allow the flow of food and medicine into cities that are encircled. But again, it's treating one of the consequences of the conflict. It's not treating the root of the conflict. And certainly, given what Mr. Putin has said, and I think even in some of an interview I think he did today, he's not showing any sign of being ready to negotiate. He really, I think, is fixed on seeing what his military can do. And so I think the West and Ukraine should be ready to negotiate, but it really can't be a serious negotiation until Moscow comes up with a more serious approach.
I'll just add, I think I agree with Steve. It was good today what apparently they were able to begin to agree in terms of the humanitarian corridors. There was some question left open by the Russian side whether they would be willing to put in place firm ceasefires to ensure the safety of those corridors, and that too will be necessary. So I hope that could be the case. But there have been some interesting developments this week. One is the fact that Emmanuel Macron has been trying to stay in touch with Putin. He seems to feel that he might be able to get through to President Putin and get some messages across. I frankly think that is important. There needs to be some high-level communications with the Kremlin, with President Putin. I know Macron was very frustrated and even angry today after his 90-minute phone call with Putin, because Putin is still, as Steve said, being very firm and tough, that he's not ready for any diplomacy. The other interesting phenomenon this week is that the foreign minister of Ukraine, Kuleba, called his counterpart in Beijing 2 days ago, and there was some indication that the Chinese may be willing to enter into a role of some kind of facilitation. I haven't seen anything yet about that. Today, the Chinese were again very tough in terms of criticizing the enlargement of NATO and that type of thing. But that's an interesting, perhaps, phenomenon. The third thing I'd like to say is that in this terrible war in Syria in recent years, where there's been no love lost between the US and the Russian troops operating there, even sometimes some very dangerous situations where they've brushed up against each other. Nevertheless, we have had an ability to communicate during this period through the use of communication lines at various levels, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff down to a more, again, operational level. So perhaps this is a time to be thinking about some efforts to communicate with the Russian Ministry of Defense, drawing on that precedent I don't know, maybe the United States administration is already doing that. And so I'm offering no background information here. I'm just speculating, given that recent experience, and even in the midst of that dreadful war in Syria, which, by the way, in its violence bears some resemblance to what is happening in Ukraine today. Nevertheless, the United States and Russian militaries were able to maintain some lines of communication.
Yeah, I might add, I think I saw a report today that, in fact, actually, the Pentagon and the Russian military defense have established at least a deconfliction channel. So I think that's a useful step because, at least my understanding was, it was actually quite effective in Syria in making sure that there was no misunderstanding. So I think this could be a good step.
Good. I didn't know that, Steve. That's good to hear that they've said something publicly about it. And that's exactly what they called them in Syria, deconfliction channels.
So obviously, all of the Russian justifications for invading Ukraine are nonsense. The neo-Nazis and the drug-addled leaders and genocide going on in the Donbass, et cetera. Complete fabrications and nonsense. And I've looked a little bit, at the Russian allegations of genocide in the Donbass and the grounds for their International Criminal Court dispute and so on. They're on very solid grounds. There have been observer missions there that have not found any genocide. However, I don't think there's a deal to be made now. I don't think it's time to negotiate. Putin's not willing to negotiate in a meaningful way. When you look at the tensions in the Donbass that were at least used as a pretext, but have been festering for a number of years, there are probably some things that can be done there if this war recedes and if those areas become Ukrainian or quasi-independent or whatever. There's probably some better work that can be done there to resolve the issues that do seem to come up a lot between the Russian and Ukrainian populations in those areas, just in terms of long-term diplomacy.
So this raises a question that I've been thinking a lot about. There are a lot of kind of ominous comparisons of this invasion to the start of World War II in 1939. But one of the things I wonder about is, in this comparison, is that this conflict is unfolding in the information age. And Putin clearly has tried to manipulate public opinion to justify the invasion. And the US and European nations were able to reveal a great deal of information about what was being planned and what kinds of strategies might be tried to undermine those efforts. And we are now getting reports from the front lines that are colored by those who are providing the information as well. So how important is the outcome of this, given that to the amount of information that we have, and perhaps misinformation as well? Steve, you pointed to the sort of need for deconfliction at the state level, but is there a role for the information age in mitigating this conflict or potentially making it worse? Who would like to take that one on? Maybe.
Well, I'm happy we're winning the information war at the moment anyway, and the very forward-leaning attitude of the UK government as well as the US government in releasing intelligence, I think, shaped that information environment early on in the run-up to the invasion, and they've been able to hold that ground. Now also we have a large number of people involved on the internet. We have this open source intelligence flow going on where there's a huge amount of information coming off, YouTube videos, TikTok videos, et cetera. It's being analyzed and pumped out by some very good analysts and non-governmental groups, really. So there's, in addition to government intelligence being released, there's other information flowing that one can place some confidence in. So I think we are at the moment winning the information war, and I didn't expect that because the Russians have been really masters of misinformation. And again, we saw it again and again at NATO during the years from 2014 up to when I left in 2019. The misinformation warfare was part of their hybrid tactics. So I think that is a good thing. We've learned a lot since 2014. It is clear we need to keep learning, however, because this space doesn't stop evolving. It's evolving all the time. And from the Soviet era, the Russians and Soviets were absolutely top-notch propagandists. So they could get their footing again rather quickly.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Rose. I think the West is so far winning the information war, and one reason was because I think the Biden administration, it basically pushed the intelligence community to allow the release of some information that perhaps 10 years ago they would not have released. So they were able, I think, to sort of put the Kremlin back on its feet. I think the Ukrainians are also, though, coming up with some interesting tactics in information war. So, for example, and this may be a little bit loose and fuzzy with the Geneva Convention for Treatment of Prisoners of War, but when they capture them, one of the things that they've shown on video, and showing this on video may be the problem, they give them a phone and say, FaceTime, call your mom. Let her know you're okay. Let her know you're being treated well. And that's a way for the Ukrainians to get back to Mother Russia, that in fact, there are soldiers fighting. I mean, soldiers that I thought that the parents may have thought were going to Belarus for an exercise are actually fighting in Ukraine, and that their son is now in captivity. I think that may be a way to sort of start getting the information past sort of the official channels in Moscow, that this war may not be going as well as the government would like to portray it in Russia. There are also, I think, some just really interesting uses of the internet and Twitter and Google. I've seen on Twitter, and this is both in English and Ukrainian now, how to make a Molotov cocktail. That information has gone around. There was one TikTok. There's been a really interesting phenomenon that I was a bit unsure of the first time I've seen it. And again, you have to take what you see on social media with a big grain of salt, but I've now seen a number of reports about Ukrainians, both military and civilian, simply finding abandoned equipment. For a tank, perfect running order, it hadn't been hit, full fuel, and the crew just left it. They found armored personnel carriers. I think yesterday they found a very advanced Russian air defense, a Pantsir air defense system abandoned. And so somebody's actually put a TikTok out. It's a young Ukrainian woman saying, this is how to drive a Russian BTR. That's an armored personnel carrier. This is how you drive it, so that you can take it back to Ukrainian lines. And all of this information is sort of going out, and including also a thread that was put out both in English and Ukrainian, which was basically how to fight in an urban warfare if you are one of these civilians who's taken up weapons and are prepared to defend a major city against a Russian invasion.
Fascinating.
Another aspect is the way that information is reaching Russian people. There seems to be a real generation divide with the older generation reliant on government-controlled state media and hearing the Putin line, but younger people in general having access to the internet and social media and being able to completely go around the propaganda essentially being put out by the state sources and forming a pretty different view in terms of supporting the war. Much more skeptical, much more likely to say Putin's not telling the truth. And one would hope to see perhaps a greater variety of views within Russia as a result of this, and perhaps ultimately a shift in Russian policy and who knows, perhaps beyond that in Russian leadership.
Rose, did you want to add to this?
Just a real quick two-finger once again. I wanted to comment on Steve's remarks. President Zelensky has proven to be a master of the information space as well. And it shows, I think, his confidence as a performer. But, when he said the other day to the Americans over the weekend, I don't need a ride, the Americans were offering to evacuate him. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. He turned into a global hero immediately. And he said today to Putin, hey, I don't bite. Are you afraid to meet with me? Let's meet. Those kinds of messages going out. For one thing, they must make people in the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin himself grind their teeth. But he's showing, I think, that he does command that information space. So that was one quick comment. The other, I was very amused today, back to the mobile phones calling home from the young Russian soldiers. Apparently, the MOD in Ukraine put out today that they would be allowed to go home, the prisoners of war if their mothers came and picked them up. I don't know if you've heard that confirmed anywhere, Steve, but I just thought, wow, now that's a masterful move as well.
Yeah, I was just one last comment on Zelensky. Today, they released an opinion poll. His approval rating in Ukraine is now 93%. He really, I think, has come into his own as a wartime leader.
Yeah, it's amazing how calm and cool he appears to be in the face of this. Well, so thank you. Gloria, you actually answered a question that came in from the audience about how much untainted information Russian people are getting. And we are starting to get some questions from the audience that I'll bring up. One of the questioners is asking why we didn't send more sophisticated air defense weapons earlier. And I would add to that, coming back to the comments you made, Rose, earlier, the extent to which not just NATO countries, but European countries, the United States have pledged all kinds of military aid and support to Ukraine in the last days, really. And I'm just wondering how likely it is that this military aid at this point is going to make a difference. Is it kind of too little, too late?
Well, one thing I know, and I've been talking to Polish colleagues, non-governmental people, just in the last day, Poland is serving a really positive role as a conduit, a place, a kind of jumping off place for getting military equipment into Ukraine, helping along with some of the other NATO countries to ensure that military supplies, ammunition particularly, is getting into Ukraine. Now, there's nothing like a good crisis to get people to finally focus and pay attention and get themselves in gear. And that is what has happened here in some ways, unfortunately, because there was hesitation among some NATO member states to really give much in the way of defensive aid to Ukraine in terms of munitions and weapons and so forth. Germany, I mentioned the problem with Germany earlier before they turned around this past weekend. They were ridiculed somewhat for saying they would send 6,000 helmets to Ukraine, but that was it. They weren't going to give lethal aid of any kind, but that has changed completely now. So in a way, we are playing catch up, but I do see that at least the NATO allies and the European Union separately are resolved now to continue the provision of military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine so they can keep up the fight.
Yeah, on the first part of the question about sophisticated air defense systems, I think the problem is, if you were talking about systems such as a U.S. Patriot surface-to-air missile, those are very effective, but it would take the Ukrainians months to learn how to maintain them, operate them, and it's really a very different system from the sort of Soviet-style air defense system that the Ukrainians have. So there has been a lot of provision by the United States, by other NATO countries of Stinger surface-to-air missiles, because those don't require much training. It's kind of point and shoot. But I think some of the more sophisticated weapons that obviously the Ukrainians could use right now, they really can't be provided in time to have an impact on this fight. So
on the flip side of this, there have been a lot of reports that the Russian troops are poorly prepared and poorly supplied. So if the conflict drags on for more than a couple of weeks, that the invasion force really won't be sustainable. Should we put much stock in that assessment? I'm asking you to speculate.
Let's hope so.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I tend to see a little bit of a sort of a self-encouraging tendency in the media to say, well, here are the Russian weaknesses, and that they can't be confident of prevailing and so on. I think what we've seen is terrific devastation wreaked by Russian forces and the use of terrible weapons. And so I wouldn't be willing to predict. I think they need a strong opposition and fight to hold them back and turn them back. I don't think we can congratulate ourselves by saying we think that they're weak and poorly trained.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I agree with that, Gloria. So we shouldn't in any way take take confidence away from what has happened. It is clear they apparently thought that they could achieve their blitzkrieg in a short period of time. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense today provided some documents, classified documents left behind, wherein the Ministry of Defense and apparently the Kremlin thought that they could get this all done in 2 weeks' time. Well, we're already into week one, and they're not going to get it all done in 2 weeks' time. And so they did not think about what they needed to do to supply food and fuel to keep their troops going. And so I think that's a real problem now. They misjudged the logistics seriously, and that is a terrible problem. It's a terrible problem for morale, I'm sure, at the moment, but I'm not saying that they could not overcome that. And the way they have overcome it this week is by pounding the cities with artillery and air power. So that's how they're trying to deal with their poor logistics, is they're just using missiles, planes, rockets.
So before we move on, we actually have a one question from the audience that's related to this, and it's about that stalled column of troops and tanks that are heading towards Kiev. Is there any information about whether this is lack of supplies, a supply chain issue, technical problems, a reluctance to move in? I haven't heard anything beyond the speculation in the media.
Ran out of gas.
Yeah, no, it could be supply problems. I saw a really interesting piece, and again, but this is somebody who seemed to be fairly knowledgeable. And what he basically had argued was that they had found this Russian Panzer air defense vehicle. It's a truck vehicle that has both surface-to-air missiles, but also anti-aircraft guns, and it's a fairly scary weapon. And it was sitting in a field, abandoned, with the tires blown out. And he basically made the observation, he said, if you let a vehicle like that just sit for a while, and some of this equipment was brought into areas near Ukraine back in April, he says, if you let it sit for a while, like 8 months, things like that happen. And he says, like in the US military, when you have equipment stored, there's a regular maintenance program where they turn the engines on once a month, they move it, they rotate the tires, they park the vehicles in a way so that the tires are not exposed to direct sunlight. But his speculation was that a lot of those, one of the interesting, when you look at those vehicles on the road, they're not out in the fields. And that it may be that they have to stay on the road because if they go into the fields, because of the pressure changes, they may blow their tires. And I would have to say here that the Russian military is really, really lucky that the Ukrainian Air Force doesn't have, say, a squadron of A-10 attack aircraft, because those things are it's an incredible target set there that at this point, the Ukrainians really just don't have the capability to strike at as hard as it could be.
Okay, thank you. So let's turn to some of the other things that are happening around this. Gloria, there's fairly universal condemnation of Russia's actions, coming from the UN General Assembly vote, to mass protests that are happening in major cities around the US and Europe and even in Russia. So does this kind of public display of outrage and opposition have an important role to play here?
Well, I encourage either of my colleagues to chime in as well. I do think there's a growing consensus. Certainly the UN General Assembly vote, very interesting to see who voted which way on that, but pretty good consensus there, 141 votes to censure Russia and demand their withdrawal. Even China abstained. China has just taken an action as one of the principles of an Asian Development Bank to prohibit any further loans or activities in Russia. And so China is beginning to show a little more cooperation. So I think it's turning into a pretty wide consensus. I think it's mainly important for the sanctions, which are starting to bite in Russia. It's certainly some of the countries that are part of this consensus are providing direct aid, military aid, and so on. So I do think it bites not just as an expression of public, of many countries' attitudes, but where those countries individually and as groups are taking actions that have a specific impact negatively on Russia.
Does anyone else want to add to this? So to take this a step further, let's talk a little bit about the role international institutions might play here. The United Nations itself, but the International Criminal Court, there's been some discussion about war crimes and about international pressure being brought to bear on Russia. Do you think that this is an effective line of attack? And I guess I would ask the sort of the larger question, which is, does this sort of flagrant assault on national sovereignty and territorial integrity raise questions about the international order that we have had really since World War II? And that's a big question, but one I think that we all should be thinking about.
I absolutely agree, Carla. And honestly, I think that is why this fight is so important. And it includes, although no boots on the ground from NATO countries inside Ukraine, but all the other ways in which the global community is engaging in the fight through sanctions, economic action, trade and export controls, and condemnation. I think what the UN General Assembly did in its vote was very powerful. So I think we have to make it clear that these are principles that are worth fighting for, because otherwise humanity is heading precisely in the wrong direction. So I do think it's very, very important. I wanted to take note, though, in terms of international organizations, of one organization that people may not have noticed much, and it's because of the strong fighting today around Zaporozhye, which is where the major Ukrainian nuclear power plant facilities are, with a number of reactors there for producing electricity. And the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency today, Rafael Grossi, appealed to Moscow, to the Russians, to take their fighters back, to move them back, to get them away from the power plant. The last thing we need is a nuclear power plant accident. So he issued that appeal today, and I 100% support him. He's also issued an appeal on behalf of proper protection of the Chernobyl site, which the Ukrainians have had to report to him officially is now no longer under the authority and control of Ukraine. It's being held by the Russians at this point. So I think it's also important what these other international organizations, very focused on their missions, much less known internationally perhaps, but they are also trying to play a responsible role. And I could not endorse more what Rafael Grossi said to the Kremlin today.
Does anyone else want to comment on this?
But just to second what Drew said, I mean, I think it is very important that Russian action be resisted. I mean, this is the 21st century. This is Europe. And we're, a few days away from a city of 3 million coming under siege by an army. And so I think to the extent that the West can push back, it's also about preservation of a system of norms and institutions that have served the transatlantic community and the broader West very, very well. So there is an extra reason, I think, to be resisting Russia on this.
And I do think the two courts are important institutions, international courts in this area. So number one, as I mentioned, the International Court of Justice. Ukraine has some smart lawyers because they immediately filed a dispute about Russia's charge of genocide, and they're on completely firm grounds. The UN Human Rights Commissioner has been monitoring the situation in the Donbass and Crimea. They have not found any genocide. So these reports are evidence that Russia's contention is false. And so I think they will win that case. And then the International Criminal Court, if somebody is determined to be a war criminal, then there are penalties for that. The person can be imprisoned and even put to death. And so if Putin were designated as a war criminal, again, how do you implement that? I don't know. But I think both courts taking action on this could have a major impact.
Yeah, let me add, I wonder if the Ukrainian legislators, I agree, are quite smart, thinking about a broader action against Russia for damages, because you're seeing a huge amount of damages. And one result of the sanctions is over $400 billion in central bank assets of Russia are now frozen in Western financial institutions. So, before it would have been hard to get at that money. There's actually now perhaps a way if they want a judgment. And my guess is that the Western countries would be very sympathetic to that cause. Maybe they can go after that $400 billion.
Well, so this brings up one area that we haven't really focused on yet, and that is the economic sanctions. And they are clearly unprecedented. And one of our audience asks, how much influence do the oligarchs actually have on Mr. Putin? And are we wasting our time a bit and trying to tie them down on the economic front? How effective are these sanctions?
Well, I think the sanctions are very effective because they have quickly, tanked the ruble, closed the stock market, and led to severe already economic crisis in Russia that will up the ante and raise pressure on Putin and his cohort in the Kremlin. So I think that they are very important. The coherence, again, of the countries around the world who are participating, and it's not only countries in Europe, but countries such as Australia, Japan, et cetera, also very far afield, but participating in these sanctions and other economic pressures. So very, very important. I did want to underscore again the importance of the export controls placed on, particularly on semiconductors. They are going to shut down Russian defense industries, shut down basically the high-tech sector in Russia, and I think lead to some real drag. Once again, there's already a huge drag on the Russian economy, but they have had a proud innovation sector, and I'm afraid now what we will be looking at is a real drag on Russian science and technology and innovation. So, maybe in a global sense, that's not a good thing. They can do a lot of good in terms of their contributions as they have historically to science and technology, but it's the way it has to be right now until their leader comes to his senses.
And there's some additional impacts. I think now both Boeing and Airbus have said they will no longer send spare parts to Russia, and they will cut off, the digital provision of maintenance information. And I think with modern jets now and Russian airlines, both for international flights, but also domestically, fly a lot of Boeings and Airbuses. But once you begin to go 4 to 6 weeks without having the availability of spare parts and the maintenance provisions, you begin to run into safety concerns. So they may find themselves with a domestic airline industry that doesn't have much that it can safely fly if this thing drags on very long.
That's a good point. So I'll play devil's advocate for a moment and just ask the question of whether or not the economic sanctions could backfire in that they push Putin into a corner. And I think there's also some indication that it could lead to a backlash from the Russian population, who are suffering probably more in the immediate term from the sanctions. Anyone want to take that?
I can try. I mean, I think the point of the sanctions is to cause that pain. I do to some extent feel a bit bad that the sanctions are going to have, I think, a huge impact on the Russian population. I mean, it's not just the fact that the ruble lost 30% of its value on Monday, but this will trigger inflation. It's going to make day-to-day life a lot more difficult. And I feel a bit bad about that. But then I look at the images of what people are going through in Ukraine. I spoke to a former Ukrainian employee of the embassy last night. Of course, it was just the morning in Kyiv. She'd just woken up. 10 air raid sirens last night for her. There's a lot of Ukrainians who are going through a whole lot of grief that are spending times living in bomb shelters and subways, and a lot of Ukrainian civilians have been killed. So I guess in those circumstances, while I have some sympathy for the Russians and how they're going to suffer economically, it's not as much as it might otherwise be.
So we're coming to the end of our time, and I did want to ask you each to share your thoughts about the human tragedy that's unfolding in Europe and the hundreds of thousands of people who are fleeing their homes and their homeland and getting separated from their families and permanently scarring lives. And I know that the people who have joined us here today are interested to know what they can do, what we can do to help. So if you have any thoughts, places to recommend that people can do things to help deal with the humanitarian crisis, I'd love it if you'd share them now. Rose, do you want to go first?
I've actually put together a comprehensive list of charities that are helping the humanitarian action that's going on, huge efforts going on, again, with Poland as a jumping off place for humanitarian aid going in, and also providing for the refugees coming out inside Poland, inside Hungary, and other European countries. And European countries, as well as Airbnb, are throwing open, apparently, their homes and apartments for people to be able to stay for a while. The European Union has said it will allow Ukrainians to stay in the European Union for 3 years with basically not having to, go through a more bureaucratic process. So I think that is all to the good. I will send to Gloria and you, Carla, my list, and you can make a decision whether for your audience this is appropriate, but it certainly has gotten a lot of very positive reaction from my friends and colleagues and family. So I'll make sure I get that to you.
Thank you. That would be wonderful. Steve, do you have any additional thoughts?
No, I think, what we're witnessing really, again, it's horrible. I mean, I spent 3 years living in Kyiv. It's a beautiful city, and sort of watching the images of places where I've been being pounded by Russian bombs. And these are places that are not military installations. This is a disaster. It's a disaster brought on by one person. But we should look for ways to try to ease the humanitarian consequences of this. And ideally, of course, the quickest way to do that is for the Russians to stop the war and bring the troops back out of Ukraine.
Gloria, any final thoughts?
Sure. I would just add to Rose's thought, there are several omnibus lists of different aid organizations. And one that we've been looking at is We Stand, www. We Stand with Ukraine. I just would mention the Commonwealth Club's a nonprofit. We don't have a lot of money to give to other people, but we've been thinking about what we could do. And we've decided to offer some of the aid organizations ads on our podcast, which have millions of downloads a year, providing their information to those who want to donate. And we're looking at the organizations, and we will soon make that part of our podcast, which does not cost money for a nonprofit to do. So the digital world offers us approaches that can help.
Well, so with that, may I just say thank you to all of you for giving us your time this afternoon. Thank you, Stephen Pfeiffer, Rose Gottemuller, and Gloria Duffy for joining us today. And I'm Carla Thorson, and this Commonwealth Club program is now adjourned.
Thank you, Carla and Steve and Rose.
Thank you.
Thank you.